welcome to another Wolftime gaming video. Today we're going to be painting up this Squirrel clan warrior to using Burrows and badges, a game by Oathsworn. It's a great game. I've been getting really into it lately and the models are absolutely fantastic. We're going to turn it from this into this. Before we get started though, as usual, let's get that kettle on. So once I got him stuck on the base, the first thing I did was give him a base coat. To do this, in this instance, I used the Games Workshop's Contrast Wraithbone spray, which is a really thin spray paint, seeps down into all those recesses really nicely and gives you a really light coating, meaning all the contrast and paints and things like that go on really well and you don't lose any of the detail from the actual miniature. Definitely one I recommend. I've been using that in Greyseer a lot lately. So the first colour I used was Jokero orange, and that was to give it a base coat on the fur really. I wanted him to be a red squirrel. He's very sort of Scottish looking. We didn't really have grey squirrels and black squirrels in the UK till we brought them back from the colonies essentially in the Americas. So I went for the Jokero orange to start with. It's a really nice orange. It looks really bright when you first put it on there, but once you put on a little bit of shade it actually looks really well and works well as a ginger paint. I avoided areas around the mouth and the feet because I wanted those to be a lot lighter than the actual ginger. I wanted them to be a slightly different colour, which we'll come on to. Just have to be careful around the rest of the miniature as well, around the material of the clothing and stuff like that, because I wanted to use some contrast paints. And obviously if I got this on there, I wouldn't then be able to use the contrast, or would have had to take that colour back to Wraithbone. So I did really sort of take my time with this one. So the next colour I used was Contrast Skeleton Horde, and this was essentially used in all those areas I just talked about, around the mouth, the feet, the end of the tail, just to give sort of lighter areas a little bit of interest really. A lot of squirrels have this sort of tan or white colour to them and to their fur. In the past I would have used Xandra Dust and maybe a little bit of a Shabty Bone to actually bring that colour up, but the Contrast Skeleton Horde essentially does the same thing, but with less steps because you don't have to shade it. You can see straight away as soon as it goes onto this fur, it drops in really nicely and gives you that sense of depth to the miniature straight away. At this point I used a little bit of Contrast Black Templar just around the nose and the mouth, just to darken those areas down to essentially make them black. And I did the eyes at the same time as well. And the one good thing about using the Black Templar paint is that it seeps down quite nicely and leaves like a slight raised area, almost like a grey sort of a colour to the raised areas of the eyes, which is really quite cool. The next paint I used was Contrast Wyldwood, and this was essentially to do his top. He's wearing like a t-shirt. He's got a bit of a kilt going on, but so I wanted to have those green as I've done with previous miniatures I've done with a Scottish theme, but I didn't want the whole of his clothing to be green, so I went with a brown sort of a colour for his t-shirt. And the Contrast Wyldwood is great for that because it adds that natural shading as with the other contrast paints. Then moving on to the green areas, he's got like a sash and his kilt. Started with the Caliban green, which is a base coat from Games Workshop. It's a really good green colour. I haven't got any green contrast paint, so I went straight with this one, as I've done with the previous minis as well that I've done with this sort of Scottish theme, and it goes on really nicely. It's a really deep colour. I used it for my Dark Angels in the past for Warhammer 40k, and it looks really effective. Did need to do a couple of coats on this one, just do a couple of thin coats on there just to really make sure it held that colour nicely. I also did the hat at this point as well. I did think about doing it a different colour, but because I'd already used the brown for the t-shirt, I didn't want to add too much to it really. I didn't want to have him too colourful and make him look too cartoony. I wanted it to look a little bit more realistic, or as realistic a squirrel with a sword can look. The next stage was using Warboss green, which is a Games Workshop layer paint, and this is what you would have usually done with the other colours in the past, is dry brush a little bit just onto the raised areas, but I didn't need to because I used contrast paints with the green because I used a base coat. It was a very flat green, and I did really want to add some depth to it, so I lightened up the edges of those areas using Warboss green, and it started to look really effective at this point. Moving on to the actual weapon itself, the sword, I use Retributor armour around the actual hilt of the sword, where he's actually holding it, make it look a little bit more like he's got a little bit of money, like the sword's a little bit more expensive, rather than it just being a big block of silver. I wanted to add this gold in there, and it's quite a nice bright gold colour as well. This is a good point to add a little bit of shading to the fur, because while you're waiting for the rest of the miniature to dry. And in this instance, I used Reikland Fleshshade just straight onto the top of the Jokero orange, and you can see straight away it adds the depth into the fur, and it looks really good. I mean, the sculpt really helps with this because it's amazing, especially around his bushy tail. The sculpt's perfect for using these sorts of paints, and it really does add a really nice layer of depth to the miniature and makes it look like it's a lot darker underneath. The sword itself was then painted with Leadbelcher. It's my standard go-to silver, really. Pretty much do all the silver I ever paint is with Leadbelcher. It's a really good paint, and you can manipulate how shiny it is as well by using Nuln oil and things like that, which obviously I'll do in a moment just to sort of darken that down. Because I needed to wait for the sword to dry, I just touched up the mouth a little bit there with Screamer Pink, just to give his tongue a little bit of colour. And at the same time I used some white scar just on his 4 teeth. He's got 2 bottom and 2 top teeth, and I wanted them to really shine up quite nicely, so I used white scar for that. I then pulled out the Nuln oil and I covered all those bits and pieces around the sword to give it some really nice shading, especially around the handle of the sword. You've got a few little recesses that I wanted to darken down a little bit, and they look really nice, and the Nuln oil looks great on Leadbelcher as well. So this bit was a little bit more difficult, and I wanted to add some essentially tartan to the miniature, and this really did take time. I just used a small detail brush and Mephiston red and went around the whole miniature and just drawing lines essentially. And I did them in a gridded pattern that you can see the sort of finished effect here, and it looks really good, but it really does take a lot of time and effort to do, probably the longest part of the actual mini. The base itself was painted with Rhinox hide, which is my standard go-to for mud. It's a nice dark brown that you can raise the colour up if you wanted to. I usually don't though. I usually leave it as the Rhinox hide because it's ideal for these sort of minis. And then I went around the bottom of the base using Corvus black, two thin coats of Corvus black. You never use one coat of Corvus black, it's not thick enough, and that really just framed the model quite nicely. And then it was a case of actually basing the model with some grass and flock and things. So you can see I used a little bit of super glue and a bit of static grass there. I've got some tufts that I just popped down straight on the top of some PVA glue, a couple of different colours, and a little bit of static grass just put on with a pair of tweezers, and there we have it. That's basically the model finished. I'm really pleased with how he turned out. I hope you like him. I think he looks fantastic. I was really worried about painting this sort of red ginger sort of coat, and I think he looks absolutely amazing. The tartan I'm really pleased with. I'm really pleased with how that looks as well. If you want to paint that, do really take your time. Just try and use a small brush. Make sure you've not got a lot of paint on there as well, because you can sort of mess up quite easily, and just really take your time with it. But I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to see any future ones. I've got lots of more videos planned, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.